Let's get real. How many times have you been told that pulling away is just a tactic? That if you go silent, you'll make him miss you, chase you, want you again? There's a big difference between pretending to walk away to trigger a reaction, and actually withdrawing from the core of your being because you're done giving to someone who won't meet you halfway. This isn't about punishment. It's about peace. And when a woman truly pulls back, not because she wants attention, but because she's reclaimed her self-respect, it lands differently. So let's flip the script. Because what if everything you thought you knew about silence, detachment, and letting go was wrong? What if the power of real withdrawal wasn't in how it affects him, but in how it restores you? Most women underestimate the impact they have when they leave a space they once nurtured. But believe me, not because you're playing it cool, but because you're embodying something deeper: stoicism, emotional maturity, restraint that stems from strength, not strategy. Why does the silence suddenly scream louder than any conversation ever did? And more importantly, what does your silence say about the woman you've become? In today's video, I'm not just breaking down his thoughts, I'm giving you the truth that most people don't talk about. No fluff. No rules. Just deep insight into the masculine mind when the energy shifts. When the pattern breaks. When you stop giving. Because this isn't about making him come back. This is about you stepping fully into your worth. And as you'll see, that kind of withdrawal triggers something he can't ignore. If you've ever wondered what men truly experience when you stop reaching out, stop explaining yourself, stop chasing. And don't even think about clicking off, because what I share at the very end could change how you approach every connection from this point forward. And it all starts with what happens when you finally stop fighting for someone who never fought for you. 1. Shocked by the silence. He doesn't notice it at first. It starts slow, subtle, like the quiet before a storm, but not the kind that screams destruction. The kind that signals clarity. A pause in the emotional noise. A full stop after a series of question marks. You're no longer texting like you used to. You're not checking in. You're not sending the little good morning messages, or asking if he's eaten, or if he's okay, or what time he got home. The rhythm he got used to, your presence, your softness, your effort, it's disrupted. But because he's been conditioned to expect your energy, your nurturing, your care, he doesn't register the silence as serious at first. He thinks it's just a moment. A pause. Maybe you're busy. Maybe you're moody. Maybe you're doing it to test him. That's how most people operate, right? Temporary withdrawal to provoke attention. But what he doesn't realize is, this time, it's different. This silence isn't tactical. It's not emotional warfare. It's not bait. This is the sound of a woman reaching her limit without shouting. A woman letting go, not out of anger, but because she's tired of holding on alone. It starts filling in the spaces he didn't even know were being filled by you. He checks his phone and sees no new messages from you. It doesn't hit him immediately, but something feels off. Not wrong. Just empty. That void where your attention used to live becomes noticeable in its absence. And here's where stoicism begins to surface, not in your behavior, but in his perception of it. Because what he sees now is a boundary. Not a wall. Not a game. But a boundary wrapped in elegance. He starts wondering, did I miss something? Did I say something wrong? But the truth is, the silence didn't start with a single incident. It built over time. And now that it's arrived, it's not leaving until it's acknowledged. See, Stoic relationships don't crumble through loud fights or dramatic exits. They dissolve through slow, graceful withdrawal. And when a woman with self-respect, clarity, and quiet confidence removes her emotional investment, the ripple effect is undeniable. Suddenly, the attention he didn't appreciate becomes the absence he can't ignore. Suddenly, the effort he took for granted becomes the space where his own effort is required. But here's the irony: most men don't feel that shift immediately. At first, they feel confused. They think, she's probably just having a phase. And so they wait. But days stretch into longer silences. Your digital footprint disappears. No stories. No likes. No posts meant to provoke. You're not watching his stories anymore. You're not reacting. You're not signaling. And this absence, this complete lack of your emotional presence, disorients him. Why? And stillness is what shakes him. Because it can't be argued with. It can't be reasoned into submission. It can't be comforted with half-hearted words. He feels the void growing. And he can't quite name it. But he feels it. Deeply. And this is where the first wave of impact hits, the shock. The realization that something is different now. And he can't access you the way he used to. Because you're not performing anymore. You're not being the bigger person by overextending. You're not softening your voice to make room for his indifference. You're not rushing to close the emotional gap he created. You've stopped doing the emotional labor. And that, to him, is jarring. Without warning, the glue has been removed. And everything starts to feel loose, unstable, out of sync. He starts questioning his assumptions. He rereads old texts. He checks your online status. He even wonders if you're talking to someone else. Not because you said anything, but because your absence is now louder than your presence ever was. And in that silence, something powerful starts to happen. He begins to realize you weren't asking for too much. You were offering too much to someone who gave too little. And now that you've stopped, it carries no emotional charge, because you're no longer emotionally entangled. You've accepted reality. And acceptance, when done right, is the ultimate power move. He can't argue with it. He can't guilt you out of it. He can't provoke you into breaking it. Because your silence doesn't come from a need to be chased. It comes from a decision to protect your peace. This is where Stoicism begins to bloom, not as a lack of emotion, but as emotional self-mastery. You're not shutting down. You're stepping up. You're no longer available for confusion. No longer accessible to half-hearted love. No longer within reach for someone who refused to reach for you. And this clarity? It terrifies him. Why? Because it's not reactive. It's evolved. It's not impulsive. It's intentional. And intentional silence is the most powerful response a woman can offer when she's been consistently unheard. The shock isn't just in your silence, it's in your stillness. Your refusal to explain yourself. Your detachment from the outcome. Your calm departure from the chaos. He realizes, often too late, that you didn't pull away to get a reaction. You pulled away because you no longer needed one. You found your center. You reclaimed your energy. And while he's still processing your absence, you've already made peace with it. That's what shakes him. That's what makes him spiral. Not the idea that you're mad, but the idea that you're done. Completely, wholeheartedly, and without ceremony. Because that kind of withdrawal doesn't beg for attention. It creates it. And as time passes, the initial shock of your silence transforms into a haunting realization. She's not playing. She's not pretending. She's not waiting. She's gone. That realization? That's where the unraveling begins. It's not instant. It's gradual. And it starts with that first moment of silence that he thought meant nothing, until it echoed louder than any goodbye ever could. And in that echo, he finally hears everything he ignored. Every need you voiced. Every moment you asked for more. Every time you stayed when you should have walked. And now, in your absence, he's left to sit with his own reflection. That's the power of real withdrawal. That's what Stoic relationships are built on, not manipulation, not mind games, but emotional sovereignty. The strength to walk away not in anger, but in self-respect. The choice to be silent not out of punishment, but out of peace. And when you make that choice from a place of inner stillness, the silence does the speaking for you. 2. Doubt creeps in. When silence stretches beyond what he assumed was temporary, something shifts. The absence you left behind no longer feels like a quiet moment. It begins to feel like a message he can't decipher. And that's when the seeds of doubt start to take root. It doesn't hit like a lightning strike. It creeps in like fog, soft but undeniable. At first, he tells himself you're just busy. He rationalizes your disappearance. Maybe you're tired, maybe work is overwhelming, maybe you just need space. But deep down, something gnaws at him, uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. It scratches at the edges of his ego, at the safety of predictability he once took for granted. What if this isn't just a pause? What if she's really done? The idea that you might have detached for real unsettles him, not because he fully understands what he's lost, but because the dynamic he counted on has changed. See, men often operate with silent assumptions. That she'll always be there. That she'll always check in. That she'll forgive and overlook and explain and stay. But now, with your withdrawal, those assumptions are starting to collapse. He replays conversations. He thinks about the last few interactions. He tries to pinpoint the moment when things shifted, but he can't. Because your silence didn't come with an announcement, it came with grace. And that grace is haunting. Because it means you've moved from emotional dependence to emotional autonomy. You're no longer reacting. You're not engaging. You've stopped investing. And without your emotional labor propping up the connection, he's left to confront the fragile structure he built on your effort. That's when the doubts start multiplying. He wonders if he misread the signals. If maybe he misunderstood what you meant. He starts thinking about the things he dismissed. The moments when you looked at him like you were hoping for something more. The times you paused before saying, "It's fine," when clearly it wasn't. And now, in your silence, those memories come rushing back, only this time, they're wrapped in clarity. Because without your words to soften the blow, his own inadequacy echoes louder than ever. He begins to feel a subtle panic, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that simmers under the surface. He doesn't know how to name it. Because vulnerability isn't his native language. But make no mistake, he feels it. It shows up in small ways, in the way he hovers over your messages, in the way he checks your activity, in the way he finds himself scrolling through your old photos, your comments, your digital presence. It's not because he suddenly remembered your worth. It's because he's realizing that you were never going to beg for him to see it. And that shakes him. He's not used to women who walk away quietly. He's used to emotional outbursts, closure-seeking, long messages filled with tears and explanations. But you walked away without drama. And that calmness is now playing tricks on his mind. Was she ever really that into me? Did I overestimate my place in her life? Those are the questions swirling in his head now. Because when you withdraw from a place of true self-respect, you don't leave cracks for re-entry. You don't play games. You don't make noise. You simply reclaim your energy, and that kind of quiet. His doubt isn't just about losing you, it's about losing the version of himself that felt in control when you were emotionally available. Because Stoicism teaches us that control is an illusion. Especially in relationships. And now, for the first time, he's confronted with that truth. The more he tries to stay calm, the more his inner voice grows louder. What if she's really over it? What if I pushed her too far? What if she's not coming back? That's the moment where the emotional tides turn. The more he tries to dismiss the feeling, the more it grows. He may talk to friends. He may pretend it's nothing. He may post as if everything is fine. But deep down, he's unraveling. And not because you did anything to provoke it, but because you stopped doing everything that allowed him to avoid himself. That's the power of Stoic relationships. They force accountability without confrontation. And now, he's accountable to his own actions in the face of your absence. He starts to wonder. It turns his comfort into restlessness. He can't even look at his phone without wondering why you haven't reached out. He tells himself he doesn't care. But every hour that passes in silence contradicts that lie. He wonders if someone else is getting your attention now. Not out of jealousy, but out of fear. Fear that someone else might recognize the value he ignored. Fear that you're done waiting to be chosen. And in that fear, the ego begins to erode. Slowly, quietly, thoroughly. He may try to distract himself. He may try to act unbothered. But no amount of distractions can erase the void left behind by someone who truly withdrew. And if you've done the inner work, if you've truly embraced your worth, then your absence carries weight. It speaks in a language only those who took you for granted can hear. That's when the internal negotiation begins. He's left to fill in the blanks with his own guilt, regret, and realization. This is not about revenge. It's about responsibility. And your silence has become the mirror he avoided for too long. The doubt becomes the doorway. Will he walk through it and grow, or will he retreat into pride? That's not your burden to carry anymore. You've stepped back. You've detached with dignity. You've chosen yourself, not out of spite, but out of sovereignty. And that's where your power lives. In Stoicism, we learn that true strength lies in non-reactivity. In the ability to remain centered in chaos. And that's exactly what you've done. You didn't lash out. You didn't beg. You didn't spiral. You simply observed, accepted, and adjusted. And now. But because he can't stand the silence. Don't be surprised if he starts showing interest, not because he's changed, but because he's confused. And don't be surprised if he tries to reconnect, not out of love, but out of fear of losing something he thought would always be there. But this time, you're not the same woman he once knew. You've evolved. You've chosen stoic grace over emotional chaos. And now, the choice isn't his, it's yours. If this resonates with you, if you've ever felt this internal shift, if you're feeling this message, take a second and like this video to let me know it's hitting home. And drop a comment below that says, number 1, if you're done chasing, done proving, and ready to stand in your worth. And of course, subscribe if you want more content that cuts deeper than the surface. Because the next part of this series, it's where things really start to unravel for him. And trust me, you won't want to miss it. 3. Ego takes a hit. It's a strange thing, really, how the ego works. It whispers to him that he has time, that she'll always be there, that even if she pulls back, she'll come around. The ego feeds on reassurance, on the illusion of permanence, on the quiet assumption that he holds more power in her world than she holds in his. And when that assumption is disrupted, when the woman he thought he understood begins to drift away without apology, without explanation, without noise, the first thing that suffers isn't his heart. It's his ego. Because the ego doesn't mourn love, it mourns control. It mourns familiarity. It mourns access. And access, once taken for granted, becomes a dangerous drug once denied. At first, he tries to rationalize it. She's emotional, she's sensitive, she's probably overthinking. These are the labels he's used to placing on women who dare to step into their power. But this time is different, and he knows it. He knows it in the way she didn't ask for closure. In the way she didn't send a goodbye text. In the way she didn't create chaos to announce her absence. She simply walked away, and not with rage, but with clarity. And clarity is something the ego cannot negotiate with. The masculine ego is built on hierarchy. On the silent belief that he is always slightly ahead, more in control, more detached, more wanted. And when that hierarchy collapses, when he realizes she is no longer orbiting around his availability, he feels it in the most vulnerable place, his self-perception. The part of him that believed he was irreplaceable. To prove her worth, he's left with nothing but himself. And in that mirror, the cracks begin to show. He wonders if he misread her devotion. He wonders if he underestimated the depth of her silence. And the irony is, it's not that she stopped caring, it's that she started caring more about herself. And that's the shift he never saw coming. Stoicism teaches us that we don't control others. We only control our response. And when a woman steps into that stoic self-mastery, when she no longer seeks to control the outcome, the ego has no battlefield left. There's no more arguing. No more defending. No more leaning on emotional leverage. He's met with stillness. And stillness is ego death. He begins to notice the way he depended on her presence to feel significant. Not because she praised him constantly, but because her energy validated his existence in subtle, constant ways. The way she listened. The way she reached out. The way she remembered the little things. The way she created emotional space for him to be himself, even when he gave so little in return. And now, without that space being held, he feels exposed. Not just alone, but unworthy of that kind of consistent affection. And this realization doesn't come with a moment of enlightenment, it creeps in through quiet self-reflection. Through uncomfortable thoughts at midnight. Through long stares at a text thread that has gone cold. Through wondering why she doesn't care to fix it anymore. And he starts to ask questions he never asked before, not about her, but about himself. Why did I think she'd always stay? Why did I act like my inconsistency wouldn't catch up to me? And the answer is always the same: ego. The ego told him she'd always need closure. That she'd always fight harder. That her soft heart meant she'd never leave for good. But now that she has, conscious of the imbalance, conscious of how her energy was being wasted on someone who didn't know how to receive it with care. And this is what humbles him, not her absence, but her elevation. Because now he realizes he wasn't just dealing with a woman who loved him. He was dealing with a woman who was evolving, and he mistook her loyalty for limitation. And now, standing in the ruins of what he didn't protect, the ego begins to crumble. Slowly, painfully, truthfully. He starts to see how much he leaned on her emotional generosity to avoid his own growth. How her validation filled the gaps in his own self-worth. How her presence allowed him to avoid becoming emotionally present himself. And now that she's gone, he's forced to feel the emptiness she once filled, not with demands, but with devotion. And the worst part? He knows it's his fault. Not because he was evil or cruel, but because he was careless. Emotionally careless. Spiritually unready. Intimacy requires presence, and he gave her proximity instead. Now, without her energy to orbit, his world feels smaller. Not because she was his whole life, but because she added depth to it that he didn't understand until it disappeared. And this is the moment where the masculine ego often breaks, when it realizes it was never about winning. It was about connection. And connection requires humility, vulnerability, reciprocity. The very things he avoided in the name of not being too emotional. But as someone who woke up, that awakening didn't come from a single fight. It came from the slow, steady realization that she deserved more than emotional crumbs. And now that she stopped asking for more, he's left with the truth: he never really gave her enough. Stoic relationships don't end in explosions. They dissolve through quiet decisions. Decisions made not in haste, but in healing. And now, all the ego has left is memory. The memory of her effort. The memory of her support. The memory of her laughter, her patience, her presence. And memory, unlike fantasy, is permanent. It lingers. It haunts. Especially when it's attached to someone he thought he'd never lose. And maybe now he'll start doing the work. Maybe now he'll begin to grow. But that growth doesn't bring her back. It just reminds him that she didn't leave because she stopped loving, she left because she started loving herself more. Because the echo of a woman who left with dignity will always be louder than one who begged to stay. That echo? It's the sound of the ego breaking. And in that break, a new man can be born, but only if he's willing to sit with the pain, to own the loss, to stop blaming her silence, and start listening to what it meant. Because when she left, she didn't just walk away from him, she walked back to herself. And that journey? That's the one he never expected. Because ego doesn't believe people will outgrow it. But now, watching her rise, he sees that she did. And that truth will live with him far longer than any apology he never gave, or any message he never sent. 4. They remember the good times, and rewrites history. Memory has a peculiar way of reshaping itself once a connection fades. What felt mundane in the moment begins to glow in hindsight. The ordinary becomes precious. The conversations once taken for granted now echo like lines from a favorite movie, soft and unforgettable. When someone walks away, not dramatically, but completely, the mind doesn't just notice their absence. It starts to reconstruct the presence they once brought. And this reconstruction isn't logical, it's emotional. It doesn't measure what went wrong, it rewinds what felt right. In the silence left behind, the mind grasps for something warm, something familiar, something that once made sense. Suddenly, colored by loss, intensified by the void. It's not about regret yet, it's about longing. Longing for the version of life that existed before the silence. Not because it was perfect. They remember the affection, the laughter, the emotional safety, but they soften the parts that caused tension. They dim the moments of emotional laziness. They forget the misalignments and highlight the harmony. It's not manipulation, it's protection. A self-soothing mechanism that kicks in when reality feels too uncomfortable to sit with. But here's where it becomes deeper. As memory reshapes itself, the emotional narrative changes too. They may start believing they were more present than they actually were. That they gave more. That they were misunderstood. That maybe the one who left was too sensitive, too impatient, too demanding. This rewriting is not always malicious. It's psychological preservation. It's easier to adjust the past than to confront the parts of self that couldn't meet the moment when it mattered most. Stoicism challenges that rewriting. Stoicism asks, what's real? What's being embellished to avoid accountability? Because the truth doesn't change just because the emotions around it do. Still, memory doesn't always care for truth. It cares for resolution. They start to fantasize not only about the past, but about how things could have been. How one more conversation might have changed everything. How one act of vulnerability could have saved it all. This fantasy is comforting, but it's also dangerous, because it detaches from reality. It keeps them tethered to what might have been, rather than what was. And yet, that fantasy is often more compelling than facing the silence left behind. Why? Because facing the silence requires accountability. It requires emotional maturity. It requires admitting that someone left not because they were cruel, but because they finally reached a point where staying became self-betrayal. And that realization is too heavy for an ego that has not yet healed. So the rewriting continues. The memory becomes romanticized. The person who once annoyed them now feels irreplaceable. The comfort they dismissed now feels sacred. The support they shrugged off now feels profound. But here's what Stoic relationships reveal. No amount of rewriting changes the actions that led to the withdrawal. No fantasy undoes the emotional negligence. No memory, however sweetened, can resurrect a connection that was starved of effort. And deep down, they know that. They know that what's haunting them isn't just a loss. It's the realization that the good times they now obsess over were never fully appreciated when they were happening. That's the part they can't escape. The laughter didn't seem special until it stopped. The check-in texts didn't feel meaningful until they disappeared. The emotional presence didn't seem rare until it vanished. And now, the silence serves as a reminder, not just of what was lost, but of how casually it was treated. And it's in that reminder that the rewriting starts to crack. The truth starts slipping through the fantasy. They remember the arguments they brushed off. The apologies they never gave. The opportunities they had to show up, and didn't. And it begins to sting. Not because they were the villain, but because they weren't intentional. They weren't present. And now, they're alone with memories that no longer bring peace, but pain. Because those good times were real, but they weren't enough to carry what was neglected. Stoicism demands that one confronts that duality. That one holds the beauty of what was and the weight of what was not. That one accepts the joy without denying the gaps. And for anyone who's ever been left by someone who stopped chasing emotional breadcrumbs, this is the moment of reckoning. The mind begins to loop. Could things have ended differently? What if the good times had been nurtured with consistency? What if presence had been prioritized over pride? These questions don't come with answers. They come with echoes. Echoes of laughter that can't be recreated. Of conversations that now feel sacred. Of a version of themselves that maybe, just maybe, wasn't enough. And that's the hardest part. Because remembering the good times is no longer a comfort, it's a confrontation. A realization that the person who once made those memories with them has moved on. While they're still standing in the ruins, trying to make sense of it all. They may reach out. Not because they're ready to change, but because they want to feel something familiar again. Reminders of what was once theirs but is now simply part of a story they can no longer continue. That's the weight of remembering the good times. It's not just about nostalgia, it's about consequence. The consequence of not showing up fully when love was present. The consequence of mistaking loyalty for permanence. The consequence of treating someone's heart like an option. Only to find they made themselves a priority. And in Stoic relationships, that consequence isn't punishment, it's perspective. It's the unavoidable truth that no amount of rewritten history can recreate the future with someone who finally chose peace over patterns. And if this part of the story resonates, if you've ever been on either side of this dynamic, let that recognition be a call to something deeper. Because remembering the good times isn't the same as cherishing them. And cherishing them isn't the same as learning from them. The past doesn't need to be rewritten, it needs to be understood. So if you've ever felt the ache of those memories, honor them, but don't chase them. Let them teach you, not trap you. And if you're watching this video right now, feeling the truth of these words settle in your chest, I want you to take a moment and like this video to let that truth breathe. Then drop a comment that says, number 1, if you've felt the emotional weight of someone remembering you too late. And most importantly, you don't want to miss how this story continues. 5. Obsession begins to brew. Obsession doesn't announce itself with loud footsteps. It arrives quietly, disguised as curiosity, as concern, as a natural desire to check in. It begins in the mind. Looping thoughts like a reel stuck on repeat, playing back conversations, glances, smiles that now carry more weight than they ever did in real time. The absence creates a vacuum. And where clarity once existed, fixation begins to take root. It doesn't happen all at once. At first, there's just a casual glance at a profile, a silent hope for a post, a story, a signal. But when none comes, the curiosity hardens. It becomes hunger. The need to know what's going on, who they're with, what they're feeling, whether they've moved on. The mind that once lived in the present now becomes a full-time archivist, sorting through old texts, photos, inside jokes, trying to decode meaning, trying to find clues. Trying to justify how something so solid became so silent. Obsession is often born not from love, but from uncertainty. When answers are no longer available, the ego steps in to create them. And those answers are rarely neutral. They tend to magnify the best parts of what was, while minimizing the uncomfortable truths. The result is a distorted lens, a hyperfocus on the other person, with an ever-fading connection to self. Obsession begins to breed rituals. They check the same digital spaces over and over. They rehearse conversations in their mind that never happened. Play out scenarios where everything resolves, where the dynamic flips, where suddenly they're wanted again. And all of this happens quietly, internally, while life on the outside moves forward. But inside, they're stuck in a cycle. Every silence from the other person feels like rejection. Every lack of contact feels like confirmation of loss. Not to family, not even to themselves, but the signs are there. The random anxiety spikes, the late-night scrolls, the tension in the body when someone mentions that person's name. Clings to patterns. Clings to hope. Clings to the narrative that maybe, just maybe, it's not over. That if the right message is sent, the right apology is made, the right post is shared, rather than a sign of dependency. So the behaviors escalate. Maybe it starts with checking, but soon it becomes strategizing. How to bump into them. How to trigger a response. How to remain in their orbit, even if it means sacrificing dignity. Even if it means shrinking. Even if it means re-entering the dynamic from a position of emotional scarcity. The self erodes. Identity becomes fused with the outcome. The silence becomes unbearable. They think about reaching out, not from a place of peace, but from panic. Just to hear something. Just to feel some level of significance. Just to break the stillness that's become too loud to bear. But that desire isn't rooted in clarity, it's rooted in fear. Fear that they're being forgotten. That they never mattered. That their place in that person's life has been overwritten by someone else. And that fear becomes a fire that burns slowly, relentlessly. It clouds judgment. Temporary relief from the loss of control. Temporary relief from the shame of having been left without explanation. But relief is not healing. An obsession never leads to resolution. It only delays it. It keeps the wound open. It keeps the story spinning. It creates a prison inside the mind, where freedom is measured by someone else's attention. And that is the most dangerous kind of bondage. The kind where the key is internal, but all focus is external. Stoicism teaches that obsession is the shadow of disconnection from the self. That when a person is fully rooted in who they are, obsession cannot take hold. Because there is no hole to fill. But when the sense of self has been outsourced to someone else's presence, the absence feels unbearable. And in that void, obsession grows. So they start to monitor. Not just social media, but energy. They analyze every shift. They wonder if a vague post is about them. They wonder if a new connection means replacement. They try to connect dots that were never drawn. And all of this is done in private, behind a mask of indifference. Because obsession is often silent. Hidden. Dignified on the outside. Tormented on the inside. And it never looks the way it feels. But underneath it all, the desire is simple, to matter again. To be seen again. To be heard. To feel significant. Yet the deeper that need grows, the further it pushes peace away. Because the more someone obsesses over another, the less they focus on their own healing. Their own growth. Their own ability to live independently from another's validation. And this is where obsession becomes spiritual warfare, a battle between the self that wants to evolve and the self that wants to stay attached to the past. The mind keeps looping. What did I do wrong? What if I had just said one more thing? What if I'm not enough? And those questions dig tunnels in the psyche, deep enough to bury self-worth. This is not love. This is entrapment. A mental maze designed by fear. And the longer someone stays in that maze, the harder it is to find their way out. Obsession promises closure, but delivers anxiety. It promises reconnection, but delivers confusion. It promises meaning, but delivers fixation. And it cannot coexist with peace. Peace requires presence. Obsession lives in the past and the imagined future. It cannot survive in the now. So what's the path out? It begins with awareness. With recognizing the pattern. With asking, am I holding on to them, or avoiding holding myself? It continues with choice. The choice to stop feeding the loop. The choice to return to the body. The breath. The present moment. The choice to pour energy into something other than the black hole of longing. Because obsession doesn't end with closure. It ends with responsibility. Radical responsibility. Ownership of what is and isn't in one's control. And that's what Stoicism brings back into focus. That peace is not about what's happening externally, it's about how we relate to what's happening. It's about breaking the dependency on someone else's presence to feel whole. And in that break, obsession dies. Slowly, quietly, firmly, until the silence that once haunted becomes space. And that space becomes sacred. And that sacredness becomes selfhood. No longer fragmented. No longer needing. Just whole. Finally. 6. Forced to face their own patterns. There comes a moment, often delayed but always inevitable, when distraction no longer works, when excuses no longer soothe. When silence doesn't just feel like rejection, it begins to feel like revelation. In that moment, the search for answers outside ends, and the mirror finally turns inward. This is not a graceful process. It is slow, uninvited, and brutally illuminating. It begins not with clarity, but with discomfort, restlessness, a heaviness that sits in the chest, an itch in the mind that no external validation can satisfy. Because the absence they thought would be temporary has become permanent. The energy they once took for granted has evaporated. The space once filled by constant forgiveness, second chances, and emotional labor has now become a void. Not because the one they lost vanished, but because that person evolved beyond begging to be understood. And now, with nothing left to project onto, they are forced to sit with themselves. At first, they resist. They tell themselves stories. That the timing was wrong. That they weren't ready. That they just didn't feel it anymore. That they were misunderstood. But none of it lands. Because underneath all of those layers, the patterns remain. Patterns of avoidance. Patterns of inconsistency. Patterns of passivity, silence, self-protection masquerading as indifference. These patterns didn't start in this relationship. They have roots. Childhood, past heartbreak, unprocessed emotions, outdated beliefs about love and power and vulnerability. And now, with no one left to absorb the impact of those patterns, they're exposed in full. The things they blamed others for, they begin to see in themselves. The chaos they claimed to hate, they now recognize they helped create. The emotional shutdowns they once justified now feel like missed opportunities to connect. And the fear they used to mask as logic now looks a lot like emotional immaturity. Stoicism doesn't shame this moment, it honors it. Because in Stoicism, self-awareness is the birthplace of freedom. Not the kind of freedom that lets you do whatever you want, but the kind that liberates you from unconscious cycles. And in this space of silence and solitude, the realization hits. They didn't lose someone, they lost access to a version of themselves that only existed in that relationship. The version that felt seen, even when hiding. The version that was held, even when pushing away. The version that was chosen, even when unavailable. And that version wasn't healthy. It was maintained by someone else's willingness to carry the emotional load. Now, with that person gone, the emotional labor returns to its rightful place, in their own hands. And it's heavy. Heavier than expected. Because taking responsibility requires more than apologies, it requires change. And change requires truth. Truth about why they ghosted. Why they withheld. Why they criticized instead of communicated. Why they chased when ignored and ignored when chased. Why they confused control for love and distance for power. The mind resists these truths, but the heart already knows. And the body remembers. The reckoning begins. They start to see the patterns in their past relationships, not as random, but as repeated. Not as bad luck, but as self-sabotage. And with that comes grief. Grief for the people they couldn't love properly. Grief for the love they were offered but couldn't receive. Grief for the connection they've now romanticized in hindsight but failed to nurture in real time. But grief is cleansing. Grief makes space for something new. Not another person. Not another dynamic. But a new way of being. Stoicism doesn't just guide people through loss, it shows them how to rebuild without illusion. And now, they see that most of their life has been lived in reaction to pain they never healed from. That the walls they built for protection also blocked out connection. That the independence they prided themselves on was often loneliness in disguise. That the "I don't care" mask they wore was just fear of being seen and not chosen. And slowly, brick by brick, those walls start to come down, not because someone else is knocking, but because the silence has made it impossible to pretend they're working. This is the birthplace of self-leadership, of emotional maturity, of true relational capacity. Not performance, not pretending to be healed, but a deep, raw confrontation with the self that says, I did this, and I don't want to do it anymore. They won't be met with manipulation, confusion, or desperation. They'll be met with grounded clarity. Not a new personality, but a more honest one. Not perfection, but presence. Because the truth is, we don't attract what we want, we attract what we are. And as long as the same unexamined patterns continue, so will the pain. Stoic relationships require that both people own their part. And in this moment, finally, the mirror is no longer something to avoid, it becomes a tool for rebirth. They may not like what they see, but they can change it. And in that knowing, they reclaim their power, not over others, but over themselves. No more blaming the past. No more rewriting the story. No more lingering in obsession. Just a quiet decision to do better. To be better. To relate with intention, not impulse. To speak with honesty, not performance. To listen, not to reply, but to understand. And that decision changes everything. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But consistently. And the consistency they once failed to offer others, they begin offering to themselves. In sleep, in nutrition, in boundaries, in self-respect. They stop seeking chaos and start seeking congruence. They stop idealizing absence and start building presence. This isn't just healing, it's integration. This is what transformation looks like when no one is watching. When the apology goes unspoken. When the ego is finally quiet enough to let the soul speak. And the soul says, you're not broken. You just weren't aware. But now you are. And that awareness is power. Not the kind that dominates, but the kind that liberates. The kind that allows someone to love without control. To connect without fear, to show up without shame. And that person they lost? Maybe it's too late to return. Maybe that chapter is closed. Maybe it needed to be. But that relationship gave them a mirror. And that mirror gave them a choice. And now, for the first time, they're choosing consciously. No longer driven by fear of abandonment, but by desire for authenticity. No longer sabotaging intimacy, but honoring it. No longer pretending not to care, but caring with boundaries. And maybe one day, if the paths cross again, it won't be a repeat of the past. It will be a recognition of growth. A moment of acknowledgement. Not to rekindle, but to respect. To say silently, thank you. You helped me see myself. But whether that moment ever comes doesn't matter. Because the change is already in motion. The silence did what words never could. It turned the mirror around. And now, for the first time. If this speaks to you on any level, if you've felt the power of this reflection, then take a moment to like this video and drop a comment with, number 1, if you're on your own journey of breaking free from old patterns and choosing something better. And make sure you subscribe. Because the upcoming videos will take you even deeper into not just understanding Stoic relationships, but embodying them. Thank you for watching, for reflecting, and most of all, for growing. Keep going. You're closer than you think. True closure begins where emotional responsibility meets quiet acceptance. Not the kind of closure people beg for in conversations that go in circles. Not the kind that demands answers that will never satisfy, but the kind that is earned, slowly and silently, in the internal work no one sees. It's the kind of closure that doesn't come from someone saying, I'm sorry, but from finally seeing all the patterns that played out and choosing to stop participating in them. It's the end of the war within. The end of the obsession, the rumination, the rewriting of the past. It's the quiet realization that peace is worth more than being right, being wanted, or being remembered. This kind of closure is the fruit of presence, of emotional sobriety, of choosing to sit with the discomfort until it no longer defines you. It stops being something to run from and becomes something to learn from. And once that shift happens, a different kind of power begins to emerge. Not reactive power, not loud power, but the kind that sits deep in the body, steady and calm. The kind that allows someone to walk away without burning the bridge, but also without leaving breadcrumbs. The kind that doesn't just let go of a person, but lets go of the need to be understood by them. That is liberation. That is maturity. And it only comes through full emotional accountability. Not just in blaming others less, but in blaming oneself with compassion. Because mistakes were made by both sides. Words weren't said. Signals were missed. Fears were projected. Love was filtered through old pain. But understanding this doesn't mean returning to it. It means learning from it, integrating it, using it as a compass to navigate the next chapter more consciously. To respond differently. To feel deeply but not drown. To acknowledge longing without collapsing into it. To witness grief and still hold the present moment. That is the evolution. That is the work. A mirror that reflected both what was missing and what was possible. And from that reflection, one learns to recognize not just red flags, but also their own green lights, the moments when they showed up with love, patience, presence, softness, strength. Those are the parts to keep. The parts that didn't get rewarded but were still offered. Because those were real. And they will be needed again, not to repeat the past, but to create something better. Not perfect. Not ideal. But honest. Because the truth is, love without self-awareness is chaos. It's beautiful for a moment, but unsustainable. What makes love last is the commitment to evolve inside it. To communicate not to win, but to connect. To pause instead of punish. To listen without defending. To stay open when it's tempting to shut down. And none of that can happen if the lessons of the past aren't honored. So this ending, this withdrawal, this silence, it's not the failure it once felt like. It's a threshold. A turning point. The moment someone stopped outsourcing their worth and started reclaiming it. The moment the narrative shifted from why didn't they choose me? To why did I keep choosing someone who couldn't meet me? That question changes everything. Because it doesn't just blame, it examines. It gets curious. And curiosity opens doors that blame never could. That's where self-trust begins to grow. Not because one has all the answers, but because they've learned to sit with the questions without needing to run. And in that stillness, in that sacred space between what was and what's next, something else is born, compassion. Not just for the one who left. Not just for the one who stayed too long. But for both. For all the versions of self that were learning in real time. Doing the best they could with the awareness they had. Making choices from survival, not sabotage. Wanting connection but fearing it. Offering love, but wrapped in armor. All of it was human. This capacity for reflection, this depth of emotional intelligence. And none of that would have been possible without the breaking. Without the loss. Without the withdrawal that forced a reckoning. That is why endings are sacred. Because they don't just end something, they shape what comes next. They clear space. They refine values. They illuminate patterns. They humble the ego. They stretch the soul. And in doing so, they give birth to something deeper than attraction, deeper than connection, alignment. Alignment with truth. With values. With boundaries. With purpose. And that alignment becomes the new filter. The new standard. The new baseline for what is allowed in, and what is no longer entertained. Not out of bitterness, but out of reverence. For the self. For the lessons. For the journey. And that reverence is what separates those who repeat the past from those who rise from it. So if the silence still feels loud, if the wound still feels open, know that you are in the middle of becoming. Not broken. Not behind. Not unloved. Just becoming. Becoming someone who no longer needs external validation to feel grounded. Becoming someone who sees red flags without romanticizing them. Becoming someone who chooses peace over potential. And most importantly, and in that integration, something beautiful emerges, not a return to what was, but a rebirth into what can be. With more presence, more clarity, more courage, more softness, more strength. The kind of strength that doesn't chase, but attracts. The kind of strength that doesn't beg, but invites. The kind of strength that no longer confuses silence with punishment. Not the rejection of connection, but the elevation of it. So let the silence speak. Let the space breathe. Let the past stay where it belongs, not as something to fix, but as something to honor. Because what's coming next isn't a repeat. It's a return, to wholeness, to truth, to self. And from that place, love will never feel the same again. It will feel calmer, safer, truer, and most of all, earned. Because it started within.